Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas Miras. My guest today is the executive director of the Benedict XVI Institute for Sacred Music and Divine Worship, which was founded a few years ago by Archbishop Cordileone of San Francisco. I have really enjoyed their work over the past few years. I recently was able to attend their Pontifical High Mass, their Mass of the Americas, which is a musical setting of the Mass commissioned by the Institute in honor of Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception and Our Lady of Guadalupe. It was a wonderful experience here in Manhattan. And my guest, Maggie Gallagher, has an interesting story because she spent decades defending the cause of marriage and the family. And then after the Supreme Court decision legalizing gay marriage across the country, she made a shift in her work and took on this role running the Benedict XVI Institute. So we're going to talk about her story and the work of the Institute. I'm very happy to have with me Maggie Gallagher. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Thomas. Is it Thomas or Tom?
I go by Thomas, yeah.
Thomas. I'm really glad to be here, and I look forward to conversing with you.
Well, so yeah, I attended this event. There were some talks afterwards. You made some rousing remarks. In fact, I'll probably play those for people, at least part of your remarks, because you can find those on YouTube.
And this is my answer to the question about how do you not despair? And the answer is you build. The forces of chaos and entropy and destruction have always been around us. And any civilization and any life worth living is crafted consciously, deliberately, spiritually by people who decide that in spite of X, what am I going to do with my life? I'm going to worship. I'm going to build. I'm going to be a maker as God is a maker. I'm going to make a family. I'm going to make love in my community. I'm going to make a parish that's vibrant and full of life and communicates what the body of Christ should be. I'm going to build a business. I'm going to follow a dream. I'm going to make a school happen where there never was a school before, and we're seeing that with classical liberal schools. Parents are starting schools, right? And that's a choice. If you look around you, wherever you are in your life, there is something you can do to build, to be a creator, to make love happen in this world now. And when you do that, something is unleashed, it's the grace of God, right? But what it means is to realize that all of those, and this, I wrote a column about this for the Catholic Herald, because I started thinking about the great masses of the past. People say, oh, there's too many problems now, we can't, it's a luxury item. Well, you think about, like, what was happening when those great masses were being made? I mean, the bubonic plague was still periodically striking Europe. You know, there were troops actually invaded the Vatican, right? And you know, they were being used as stables. There were depressions. There were wars. There was, you know, children. Every human being who dared to love and marry and build a family lost children, which is something that's so unusual now that it's a special heartbreak. But we exist because all of those who came before us chose to love and to make and to build. And I think for me, at least, I'm a Martha, not a Mary. That is what it means to have faith.
And that resonated even more with me because I was talking to Father Roger Landry, who's been on this podcast before a couple of years ago at the event. And he was telling me, well, you should really talk to Maggie because she has a very interesting story. She spent all this time, she was sort of at the top of the field defending marriage for 20 years and then shifted gears. And so I looked you up. I started Googling you. You know, I had heard of the National Organization for Marriage, which you were the co-founder of. And I wasn't familiar with you other than the Benedict XVI Institute lady, though. So So I was fascinated to read about you. I found this really long NPR profile of you from 2013 that was
Oh.
surprisingly sympathetic.
Yeah, once
And
you
then
retire, they get more sympathetic.
that's right. Yeah. And then a long, even longer Slate essay, which was less sympathetic but also quite interesting. Um,
Yeah, I do remember that interview. He's a really good guy. What's the name of the reporter? You don't remember offhand? I
I
mean,
don't remember.
senior moment. I think he tried really hard, but he couldn't seem to comprehend why anyone would oppose gay marriage. And so I end up kind of looking like an inexplicable automaton in that piece, but he tried.
Right, right.
It's kind of strange because he did go, he talked to a lot of people. He did find that I have normal human relationships, but
Hmm.
he still couldn't figure out how to put that all into the piece. But anyway, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, so I was reading all this stuff, and it was also I couldn't imagine such a profile happening, like the NPR one, which was very sympathetic, um, at least to you as a person, happening even today. I mean, it's a mark of how much the culture has changed in just 10 years. But yeah, so I was fascinated. I was going on C-SPAN, watching some of your old
My
appearances,
goodness.
but you really were sort of the public face of the anti-gay marriage movement for quite some time, and earned a sort of grudging respect from some people on the other side. So that's fascinating. So maybe we can just start there. I mean, you were involved with that for a long time, and I understand that it was partially for personal reasons. Can you tell us about how you got into the cause of marriage and the family? Because it was before the gay marriage thing
Yeah,
even
no,
became the main
we
issue.
didn't expect to be fighting gay marriage. I got involved because I was a pro-life atheist, and my senior year at Yale, I got pregnant and gave birth to my oldest son in October of 1982. And that kind of plunged me into thinking about the things that people were saying at the time. The cultural energy was around feminism and around two big ideas from my perception. And one is that there are no differences between the sexes at all, and that gender is infinitely malleable. Those are two related versions. There are no natural differences. They're all cultural creations. And I like to say that I don't think there are any men ever who actually believe that. Don't
Hmm.
write in. I know
Yeah.
there's always an exception, but it's the thing that men say because when it makes women happy to hear it. And
Hmm. Yeah.
I found that just in my own personal life, as I started to reflect, that it was so obviously untrue and yet so endlessly propagandistically repeated. And it was the source of, I think, a lot of problems, that instead of a reformist feminism, because I think it's obviously true that the gender roles as they were conceived from the 1950s were causing a lot of friction and needed to evolve in various ways. But instead, we got the first of many radical sexual movements, or the first, the gay marriage movement really being the second one, quickly replaced by the transgender one, which was, it takes an enormous amount of energy, cultural energy, to sustain a lie about human nature, as the Soviet Union found with communism.
Hmm.
And that was one piece of it. And the other was the related idea that marriage was not important. And it became very obvious to me. I like to say I was one of the most privileged single mothers, unwed mothers in history, having both a warm, supportive, married, intact family to come from, and also a Yale degree, which is extremely helpful if you're going to be an unwed mother.
Hmm.
But it became obvious to me that I could not offer to my son the same things that were offered to me. I mean, I think I was a good mother, and I think compared to a lot of kids, if that's your standard, he was fortunate and he's a good man, so that's good. But I don't, the lie that a woman alone can do as well as a loving mother father was, causing terrible damage. And I felt really called to confront it after both reflection and I was at my first job. I went back to work when my oldest was 3, and I worked as an editor at National Review. And so I started to see this social science evidence crossing my desk. And so the related lie, of course, is that you don't need to be married because men and women can still raise their children outside of marriage. So I
Mm.
remember seeing this study saying that children of single mothers who were being raised by single mothers were more likely not to see their father at all in the past year than to see them as often as, I think it was once a month, but it was in the 80s. So forgive me, I may have it, but something like that, a very powerful study. And, I felt that there was a need for young women's voices at the time. And I started focusing my writing on that. And I wrote a first book, which is still a really good book. And occasionally I run into pastors or other young women who are still reading it. It's out of print, but you can find it online like everything. And it was called Enemies of Eros: How the Sexual Revolution is Killing Family, Marriage, and Sex, and What We Can Do About It. And it is it's a very interesting book to me to look back on, because I had not read John Paul when I wrote the book, but there is a lot of overlap with
Mm.
teachings in love and responsibility. Uh,
Mm.
so it's almost like it's a reflection on all of the falsehoods associated with the sexual revolution, including this idea that fundamentally it is the enemy of eros, or romantic love, because that is a reality based on sex difference. And at that time, I saw the women who were most likely to ideologically deny sex difference, in many cases, were ending up, I don't know, I would just think one example with a Turkish man who beat her occasionally, right? So
Mm.
that's, the psychological
Wow.
principle that denial, the return of the denied, like you repress, you deny it.
Mm.
It's almost like Victorian times when women were encouraged to deny the reality of sexual desire altogether. But it's that same like cultural pressure to deny reality in the service of, I don't know what, I guess educated women came to believe that the idea of gender itself was the enemy of their fulfillment as women, which is one of
Mm.
those peculiar things that we still live in. I mean, the form it takes now is that boys are doing very badly. That's been true for a generation on average. And we cannot stop focusing exclusively on girls. And it's a wonderful thing to focus on girls. But meanwhile, the fact that a whole generation of boys are not going to college, they're not getting into work, they therefore do not become attractive partners. So you see women have a much harder time finding a partner, because the reality is that although men are not always, but often willing to take care of women financially, women are not willing to take care of men who do not at least provide a baseline of
Mm.
support, leading to that great saying coming out of the African American community: "I can do bad on my own." Right. So it's part of the conundrum we
Wow.
are that, and I'm just blathering on and on. So I probably should stop and let you. Where do you want me to go with this from here?
No, it's okay.
That was
You.
let me just cap it by saying this. So that was my life since I started as a writer around the age of 26 in New York City with my 3-year-old boy. And then until around the year 2000, in various ways, marriage was the primary thing I worked on. I helped found the City Journal magazine of the Manhattan Institute. I joined the Institute for American Values. I wrote a second book on no-fault divorce, which is called The Abolition of Marriage: How We Destroy Lasting Love. I wrote a relatively influential book with the University of Chicago professor Linda J. Waite, which is called The Case for Marriage: Why Married People Are Happier, Healthier, and Better Off Financially, and basically joined the team that David Blankenhorn assembled in the 90s to begin to contest the idea In 1990, when I entered this debate, if you said marriage really matters because children need a mom and a dad, you were a religious zealot who hated single mothers. And 10 years later, thanks largely to his work and the scholars who gathered around him and the experience of the way it jived with the experience of cultural elites as well, you could say, all things being equal, children are better off if they're raised by a married mom and dad, provided that marriage is not high conflict and violent. And nobody would disagree with that, basically. We basically won that debate. And I planned on spending the next decade, the 2000s, coming up with policy and cultural and other initiatives to help strengthen marriage. But instead, we decided to have, I didn't decide, but the powers that be decided to have a debate about gay marriage, which pretty much disrupted the whole coalition and put an end to those efforts. And I felt very strongly called from a marriage issue to explain that this really was a major inflection point. It's not just being nice to a tiny number of couples. We were making a decision together about what marriage is for as a public institution. And if two men are a marriage, then marriage is really not intrinsically about what it's been in every human society that we know of, the way to bring together the two great halves of humanity, male and female, to make and raise the next generation. And so that's why I entered the gay marriage debate, first intellectually, and then I founded an activist organization. So,
Well, let me ask you this, and I hate it when people say, as an excuse to not fight the direct fight, oh, let's focus on the underlying issues. But since you just said you had originally planned to spend that next decade focusing on ways to strengthen marriage, and then the gay marriage thing came up and you felt like you had to fight against that, given the way things have turned out, obviously somebody had to fight that fight, and you shouldn't regret it. But is there any sense in which you think that it would have done more to work on the thing you had originally planned to address?
We didn't decide that gay marriage was the premier marriage issue. But once it's there, if you ignore it, you're just not relevant. And there was literally no way to continue. What we had done is gather together people across ideological lines around the thing that we agreed with, which is marriage matters because children need a mom and a dad. And once gay marriage became the dominant cultural, intellectual movement on the left, they would no longer tolerate saying that. So you're going to have to try to protect and strengthen marriage, being unable to say that its purpose is bringing together men and women to make and raise the next generation. So I think that's where we are. I mean, the marriage collapse continues. I always felt that if we lost in the public square, the possibility would be to go inside the churches. But the other truth is the churches are now consumed with how to deal with the ongoing legal and cultural and educational and propagandistic teachings that are so contrary to the teachings of Christ. So there's there's not a lot of, and in the Catholic Church, you're facing right now, in addition, the collapse of mass attendance due to the pandemic, which is ongoing, and then the uncertainties created by some interpretations of what Pope Francis is doing, and he does seem to like the idea that we should all be shaken up. And people ask me what he's doing, and I don't really know. God bless him, and the Holy Spirit must be trying to help someone other than me, which is fine. It's not all about me. But I sometimes think he's just trying to put us all through a version of the Ignatian exercises where they tear us all down and then the Holy Spirit builds us up all back together. And I'm not sure it works with 1 billion people, but he's given it a good try.
I like what you said about, you're not relevant if you're ignoring that direct fight about the nature of marriage. And that's kind of how I feel. It drives me nuts when people on the abortion issue say, "Oh, let's focus less on the legal and more on, on the root causes or all these other things, quality of life things." And it's like, yeah, but like nobody's going to oppose you on that because that's not relevant. You're not a threat to anybody if that's the way you're going. It's not that those things aren't important in their place, but you do have to fight the battle of the basic right to life.
The way I would think about it, I really honestly I feel that people have different callings. So I don't know what any individual person is called to do. Where I object to is the idea that rather than at least quietly not interfering, stepping up to criticize the people who are keeping the issue alive in the public square. And I always ask people, if you think the political the arm of the right to life movement is the problem, go look at Europe, go look at Canada, go look at any place where they didn't have this movement, and look at the reality that we are about, most likely, to win the overturning of Roe v. Wade. That was 2 generations of very hard work by people who, I mean, really, except for the gay marriage issue, there's probably no other issue which gets you more hostility in the public square.
Sure.
We actually did a bus tour when I was involved with the federal marriage amendment in the, I don't know, probably around 2006 or 2005 with the SBA list. And they were like, oh my gosh, we thought we had it bad. But they do. I mean, and I just think it's, if you feel that this is not what you're called to do, I can't tell you. I mean, there's so much work out there. Go and till your orchard. But it's not good to be blaming or distracting from or discouraging the people who do feel called to fight for the core human right. I mean, this is a mass killing. So there are lots of issues and they're all important. And God bless you if you don't feel called to speak out on this, or you feel it would hurt something good that you're doing. People have to make prudential decisions about where it is. And one of my insights about the gay marriage debate early is, I was surrounded by Chuck Colson and James Dobson and all the visibly important social conservative evangelicals at the time. And they were like, let's speak up. Let's all speak up. Let's fight. And meanwhile, people were losing their jobs. They were going around to the corporate boards of major organizations and telling them basically, you stand down or you don't fight, or we're gonna explode your funding base. And it's not just cowardice. People, the realities of power are that sometimes you have to decide that's not, no. But if your issue is marriage, I don't understand how you could not speak out on this fundamental issue. And, they to win this debate, they had to go to the Supreme Court, right? They did not win it in public opinion. And that's a strike against its legitimacy. We'll see how it unfolds. But right now, it's just, the marriage situation is just terrible. Nobody's getting married and nobody's having babies. And it's, of course, that's not true. Nobody. And, even in very religious people, the pathways to bring male and female together seem eroded and hard to find. And that's an abandonment of the next generation. It's a marriage culture is not the job just of the 2 spouses. It's everybody's job.
This is kind of a tangent, but I've always felt that, well, let's put it this way. I would be much more nervous about saying in a social situation with non-Catholics, I'm against gay marriage, than about saying I'm against abortion. I've always felt for some reason that it's slightly more acceptable or understandable to people that you're against abortion, even though ironically, the abortion issue probably affects way more people personally, in terms of the number of women who have availed themselves of that legal abortion option, versus the number of gay people, let alone the number of gay people who actually get married. Right. But is that your sense as well, that for some reason there's actually,
I think it's
even though it's been around less time, people understand it less if you are opposed to gay marriage?
See, the thing about the life issue is people may have problems understanding why you think an unborn child is a child. But once you state that premise, they do understand why it's not okay to kill a person, right? So it fits more within the kind of classical liberal American cultural foundations. Marriage
Mm,
is a social institution, and we don't really understand social institutions and how they function in our
mm,
individualistic society. And one of the points about I used to make about marriage as a social institution, uh, which, as I said, exists in virtually every known human society, not always in the form, mostly not in the form that we have it, but visibly about getting a father for children and directing the erotic energies of the young in a way that is fruitful, right?
mhm,
So the the thing about a social institution is they arise to solve problems that are social, not individual and personal. So if you feel lonely and you'd like romantic love or whatever marriage means now to the culture, now that gay, two men can be a marriage, that's just your own personal problem, right? You wouldn't have a universal social institution if you didn't have this profound need that keeps it's rooted in human nature and keeps arising. And when you start looking at it that way, I don't think it's hard to find, which is basically sex makes babies, society needs babies, babies need a mom and a dad. You put those
mm,
three truths together and you get some version of marriage, right? And the reason why it's always considered not just a private and personal choice, but something that affects the whole society. And the reason why it's celebrated and encouraged rather than just one of many equally valid options. But it's never been universal. There's always been people who don't get married, and there, in most cultures, there are marriages that don't work out. And interestingly, divorce is often easier than it was in the classic Catholic or Protestant culture. But identifying a father for a child and sharing the responsibilities of raising those children in various ways is pretty much happens over and over again. And so, but I think that's a challenge. I would make this argument and I would see that half the audience would be nodding their heads and they get it. The other half literally couldn't hear an argument in that. It's the only time I've really failed in being able to make myself understood. And it's partly because the debate was structured by the legal debate and they wanted a direct harm to an individual, right? That's the only thing they accepted. If two guys married, how does that hurt you? And I'm like, if there is no social institution to bring men and women together, it's going to hurt all of us. But they couldn't hear that argument.
I've read that you were basically seeing the gay marriage issue coming before anybody else did. Is that the case?
No, not really. There was a guy at Catholic University Law School named Dave Coolidge who tragically died of a brain tumor in his 30s. And I remember he asked me to sit on, and he must have been ill at that point, on a meeting that he had called to discuss. Well, first of all, I remember we were all at a conference in maybe the late 90s, and he was, I don't know, asking me if I was interested in the gay marriage fight. And I was like, no, I don't think so, right? The marriage fight affects all of us. That's a kind of side issue. And frankly, I didn't think it would ever happen, right? So
Mm,
I, like everyone in the marriage movement I was involved with, we all resisted getting distracted by the Gay Marriage Institute, the gay marriage issue, until in November of 2000. Okay, so the Goodrich decision in Massachusetts, which was the first state court decision requiring gay marriage, we knew it was going to come down in November, and for some reason, we all knew it was going to be for gay marriage. At which point, it was no longer a theoretical debate, right? It was
mm,
happening, and I remember talking to my friends, scholars, and activists, and psychological professionals, and others that we were all working on marriage together. That our days of being able to avoid this were coming to a close, and I personally felt very called to speak about it as a marriage issue. And I quit my job. I had a check for $5,000 or so from a donor. And at that point, my husband was not employed, and I had a mortgage and two kids. And I started the Institute for Marriage and Public Policy. And the arguments that we made kind of went everywhere because the political class knew they didn't want to talk about homosexuality and they didn't understand how to talk about it as a marriage issue. So that was how I began to be the one of the leading spokesmen. And then we founded the National Organization for Marriage to fight for gay marriage politically. So, and that just exploded as an organization. And so that was from 2003 to 2011. That was kind of tough 7 or 8 years of my life. I don't really recommend fighting gay marriage.
Let's go back. You said you were an atheist in college. When does the Catholic faith come into the picture?
Well, I'm a revert. I was raised Catholic till the age of 8, and my mother left the church and never came back. And we continued to go to Mass. We were classic Christmas and Easter Catholics. And I became an atheist in 7th grade. And so the life issue was maybe the first issue. You know, Roe v. Wade was 72. I was 12. So in high school, I remember it being a kind of vivid debate, and I began to think about it. I became a political conservative, largely through reading Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged. And so I joined the Party of the Right of the Yale Political Union, and the debating process continued. There's quite a few. I don't know what it's like now, but at that point, it was an issue that was debatable in those circles. That was by no means everyone, and we debated it quite a lot philosophically. And I remember coming to the conclusion that I have never heard an argument for why it's okay to kill an unborn human being that we would consistently apply in any other context. And it became clear, and I think it is true, that basically what happened was the sexual revolution, and people started having a lot of sex without being married. And so they started to get pregnant at times. And if they were going to continue to live the life they were living under the cultural rules or absence of rules that then existed, that they felt they needed to be able to kill their own children. And I think that is in fact the truth. And you see it it's funny, Archbishop Cordileone was talking about this recently, how the movement shies away from talking about what it's for all the time. It has to talk in euphemisms. It has to avoid and distract the issue. It has to call it women's health, because it's extremely hard to explain why it's okay, and particularly why it's okay for mothers to do this to our own children. Because we have a generic, and this is something I wrote about too, which I don't think many people have made that point. We have a general obligation not to kill people, but we have a much bigger obligation to take care and protect our own children. And it's not because we chose them, right? That whole importing of choice as the reason for ethical obligation doesn't work with the family. I mean, you can make it kind of squeeze it into marriage, but the family is the place where you're related to people, whether you like it or not, right? That's what distinguishes family from friendship or other important relationships. So that bad faith. So anyway, and then I had a baby out of wedlock, and I started thinking about sex and marriage. And I remember being particularly struck by understanding conceptually in a blast when I learned the Catholic teaching on divorce is not that divorce is wrong, but that it's impossible, right? In a sacramental marriage. And I remember thinking that is in fact what I wanted in a marriage. I wanted a marriage that was unbreakable in concept, in essence, in being. That is to say, I wanted a relationship with my husband that was like my relationship with my baby, which is like, you can kind of theoretically imagine some extreme circumstance when you might have to separate yourself from your child, like he's a homicidal maniac, but they would never not be your child, right? They would never, the relationship would be always open to being restored. And I don't know, I guess in that and the realization that you don't really raise children on your own, you raise them in community, led me in my late 20s, 27 probably, to decide to come back to the church and to raise my uh, son in the church. Maybe it was 28 because I think he was older than 5 when he had his first Holy Communion. Yeah, so I think he was a little old for the age. But anyway, around that time, and that was kind of the process. So it's unusual because I basically reason and reflection into um, most of the so-called hard teachings of the church on sex and marriage, and the one, I mean, including not 100% on procreation, except to say it became obvious to me that the most important fact about sex is that it could make a baby, which means that you, if you're going to be a good person who takes care of your babies, you can't have sexual relationships where you're not in a position to give your child a mother and father, which means you can't have sex if you're not married, and that the fertility of the sexual act therefore shouldn't be divorced from the rest of its meanings.
Right.
It's central. So I'm kind of a conceptual Catholic, really. I kind of thought my way into the church, and whenever people talk about these so-called hard teachings, I don't even really think they're the hard teachings of Christ. Like, don't cheat on your wife or divorce the wife of your youth. Okay, that can be hard sometimes, but what's that stuff about, like, forgiving your enemies and doing good to those who do you wrong? I mean, who does that?
Mm,
It's like, wow. So
yeah.
there you go. God is better than we are.
Oh. So you were Catholic, for the whole time during the gay marriage fight.
Yes, yeah. So from my late 20s, and when was I? 2003. I was born in 1960, so I was 43 at that point.
Hmm. So, going back to the Supreme Court decision
Hmm.
of Obergefell, one of the main things I wanted to ask you is, after all that time fighting for marriage, what was it like seeing the goal slip away like that?
I knew it was going to happen at that point. I mean, I left the National Organization for Marriage because it became obvious to me that the strategy that they were pursuing, we were pursuing, what wasn't going to work, which was fighting state marriage amendment battles around the country. And
Hmm.
indeed, in 2012, they lost 4 of them. But even if they'd won them, I don't think it would have affected Anthony Kennedy at all. So I don't remember being stunned by it. Um, I had always seen that if we built the organization as I envisioned it, the National Organization for Marriage, that if we lost in the courts, the next phase would be building and extending our political capacity to protect traditional marriage believers. Because another truth, which people talk about social conservatives being in politics, mostly they're not. Mostly they used to be able to go on TV and talk like they're on politics, but they didn't actually build political organizations. Those are 501c3 messaging, maybe a little voter registration, maybe a little lobbying, but except for the pro-life community, and especially with the Susan B. Anthony list, which began to do the dirty work of it. So one of the things that happens if you're pretending to be in politics is you don't enter fights unless you're sure you're going to win. And then you
Hmm.
claim that you helped win them, and then your donors are happy and they give you more money. And I'm not saying this was a conscious process to get money. I just, when you're in an organization that can't really act politically, you do what you can. And they're important organizations and they do good work. And a movement needs, like, messaging organizations and intellectual or academic organizations and grassroots organizations, but it's this giant hole there that we didn't build the capacity to elect our friends when they stood up for us, or to defeat our opponents when they went after us. And that's partly why we are in such a weak position, but also why the pro-life position is not as weak, because they have demonstrated. Trump was the most practically pro-life president we've ever had. That is, he did the most to promote the pro-life groups who helped elect him. And that's because he recognized it was a winning issue for the GOP. Whereas we have this split where the consulting class would tell all the politicians, oh, that's culture war, stay away from that, right? So at any rate, the reason, pro-lifers did many, many things, all of which were important to keep this issue alive, including crisis pregnancy centers and charity work, and just so much work. So many people working so hard to defend the unborn. But one of the things that as a movement they did is they developed the capacity to actually go into swing elections, communicate with soft Democrats, mostly Hispanic women, turns out, are quite appalled to learn how pro-abortion Democrats are, and in other ways make a difference and show that they are. You don't know unless you are willing to risk the possibility of losing. That is, if you only enter in ways where you're pretty sure you can say we won, you're not relevant and you're not important politically. So hats off to the pro-life movement, especially the Susan B. Anthony list, for doing that work, because it's really not easy, and you take a lot of hits for it. Maybe not as many hits as for gay marriage, but that's not the yardstick.
So it was observed by some people commenting at the time and talking to you that in the wake of Obergefell, you switched gears to trying to defend the rights of people who were opposed to gay marriage in their jobs and and to be able to participate in the public conversation without being called bigots.
It's not really. What really happened is that I lost control of the National Organization for Marriage. I lost faith in the strategy they were pursuing. I went to the executive committee and the board, and I asked them to split resources so I could pursue a more direct political strategy at the federal level, which at a minimum, I don't think it would have stopped gay marriage, but it would have put us in a position to have a political organization to fight for traditional marriage believers. And they said no, they wanted to continue to pursue the state marriage amendment battles. This was before the loss of all 4 states in 2012. And so I stepped out. I said, I can't lead people into this battle. I don't believe in this strategy. And I kind of stepped sideways into a sister organization, American Principles Project, and wasn't doing all that much, frankly. I did some useful things, but and eventually Archbishop Cordileone asked me to. We'd been talking for a while, I guess, when I stepped down from NOM. I met him during the Prop 8 fight, which began with a conspiracy of Catholics in San Diego to get what became Prop 8 on the ballot. So we were friends, and he started talking to me if there's anything what could I do for him. And eventually he said, well, there's this Benedict XVI Institute. And I like to say I had this problem that my husband did not want to move to San Francisco and live in a shoebox on a non-profit salary. So eventually I said, well, what if I don't move there? What if I just fly back and forth a lot? So I became bicoastal in summer of 2017.
Wait, so do you live in New York City?
Not anymore. No, I moved to Washington during the National Organization for Marriage.
I gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, I'm in the DC area.
I see.
Yeah, I'm bicoastal.
So you ended up getting involved with that. I mean, how did he pitch the idea of your involvement with that organization to you, and how did you think at first? What was your initial reaction to the idea of getting involved with something totally different from what you had been doing before?
I'm trying to remember. I mean, we started talking about whether I could come and join the Archdiocesan communications team, and I actually went out there and talked to some people and kind of shadowed him to see what an archbishop does with his time. He said, "It's really boring, Maggie." No, he didn't say exactly that, but um, he and I came to the conclusion at the time it was two things. First of all, I said to the archbishop, "They're gunning for you. You don't want them to be also gunning for your communications director, right?" So that just seemed a bad fit. And also, I felt like at that time, my primary calling is as a writer. So the activism part was a diversion. I mean, I basically still think of myself as primarily a writer.
Hmm.
And so, but um, I have always been interested. I mean, what I understand how culture works from my first phase of structuring and winning the marriage debate about fatherlessness in America, and then even more from losing the debate about gay marriage in America. I understand a lot about how culture works. And, James Davison Hunter laid out the theory, which matches my experience directly, and not in the book by the title, where he gets distracted by how much he doesn't like Christian conservatives, but an essay he wrote called "To Change the World." And so I always thought that I would go into the church in some way, and Archbishop Cordileone asked me to do it. And it's very, I like to say I'm not an expert in sacred music or liturgy, but that I understand. I have built three successful nonprofit organizations, two being the primary person, the Institute for Marriage and Public Policy, which is a small think tank that preceded the National Organization for Marriage. And then I was involved in founding the American Principles Project, although not the key player. And usually it's very hard to hire someone who understands how to start up an organization, because if they do that, they're probably running their own organization.
Right.
So that's what I brought to the table. It had been in existence for a couple of years. We helped define and refine and give it a mission, which is very important because you work backwards from the mission to projects. And I very much have a startup mentality, right? So we try we stay very clearly focused on the mission. If we break the rule, we do it for a reason, and then we come back to that, right? And then we see what's working and resonating, and we do more of that. And if it's not working, we try something else. And that, so the marketing, the fundraising, the organization building is what, and the mission focus, I think, is what I brought to the table. And it's been a really interesting ride. So I was looking, I like to do things. It's almost a form of narcissism, right? I like to do two things. I like to do an important mission that if I don't do it, I don't think it's going to happen. And the second thing I really like, which is not narcissism, is I like to serve people that I actually love. And Archbishop Cordileone kind of brings those two things together with the Benedict XVI Institute.
Hmm.
So it's been very, very, it's been an interesting ride. And then, we had a second inflection point during the pandemic shutdown when San Francisco officials began to just abuse the church, to the point where they're opening art museums, but saying only one person can be in a church at a time for private
Hmm.
prayer.
Yeah.
And so when he decided that before he segmented, right? We have the Benedict XVI Institute and its mission, and we've worked very closely together on that and continue to do so. But at that point, when he felt he needed to go public and oppose the establishment in San Francisco, we just I threw all our resources, and in particular, fighting gay marriage was like a 7-year crisis PR experience. So
Hmm.
um, we helped him get the attention that he needed it actually brought it to the attention of the Justice Department. The Trump Justice Department did what the Bush Justice Department would never have done. They sent a letter to San Francisco telling them that their actions are probably unconstitutional, almost certainly unconstitutional, which letter, I'm said, would mean that it would be very hard for a lawsuit brought by the archdiocese to get thrown out of court, right? It meant they knew they were going to have to defend it, and that it was very hard to defend what they were doing. It really did show animus, probably not on the mayor's part. Probably somebody in the bowels was just sticking some stuff into the regulations. But anyway, so, and then the other thing that happened during that time with Free the Mass is I said we need to launch a petition to support the Archbishop. And I originally just thought of this as a PR point. Well, we'll get 1,000 people to sign it, and then we'll release a press release saying 1,000 people support the archbishops. But the list just went, right? It went in a month. It went from like 0 to 40,000 people signing that. And I realized that this was the basis of an important ongoing communication tool for the archbishop. Which most, people say the bishops never speak out. The reality is they do speak and nobody pays attention to them, right? So this is part of what we learned about how culture works, and part of what we took on an expanded role in archbishop communications, just based on the skill set we have. And I have an incredible digital marketer, heroically missionary, and mission by design. He's not taking, I told him you have to drop all those other clients though, so you can't hire him, I don't think. But he's great, Kevin Kekvinsky. And, he did it because he's the one who's taking these actions and making these speeches and being willing to wade out there in the public square again and again. But we did help make sure that when he did that, it got noticed. So
yeah,
he's a very humble man. He doesn't really like self-promotion.
I admire him so much, and I think that it's amazing that this person who cares about arts and culture and stuff is the same person who is so strong on the moral teachings of the church. And this wonderful prayer and fasting campaign for the conversion of Nancy Pelosi, which I've been taking part in almost since the beginning. It's so beautiful. And, I understand everybody wants the bishops to excommunicate someone, and that's still, I think a part of what has to happen eventually. But he's really focusing people on the spiritual aspect of it, which is that this is a soul that's in danger. And also that we need to be engaged spiritually, not just by posting on social media or by getting involved politically or whatever. We need to be involved in prayer and fasting. And so having everybody send roses to Nancy Pelosi and pray and fast and pray the rosary for her and fast for her every Friday is just an amazing thing.
Well, nothing has ever been like it. I don't think it's, and God bless.
Certainly not.
But it also, I remember I get letters back. Our list is anyway, and a woman was saying, it was really, really hard. Because you know what human beings like to do when there's a woman who they see as their political opponent doing bad things? The normal human instinct is to want to hurt her, right? And so I do think, she was like, it was really hard to pray for Nancy Pelosi, but I did it, and it was really transformative for me. And I'm like, yeah, that's the Archbishop. And he also fasting, right? We talk about prayer, but fasting is very consistent with the Catholic. Other cultures fast and other Protestants fast, but it's kind of incarnational. It's something you feel in your body, and it's also related to the belief that Christ, by his suffering, could atone for our sins, is what leads to a lot of classic Catholic practices, like like people say, what's the point of giving something up? Well, one of the points is there's a lot of points and a lot of psychological benefits or spiritual benefits, but part of it is the belief that if you voluntarily suffer for the soul of another, that has a power. It
Yeah.
makes something different in the world. So.
And it's neglected in the church. And I mean, and I can say that personally for myself too. I mean, like my prayer life in terms of sheer amount of time spent in prayer has always far outpaced the amount of fasting that I do. And I need to bring those two closer together so that my prayers will be more devout and more, efficacious. And so I think he's doing something really amazing. And it's like, he's not just doing it for the unborn babies. He's not just doing it for Nancy Pelosi, but he's doing it for all the Catholics who are participating. And because the point is about saving souls, obviously, obviously there are many more souls involved in this whole problem than just Nancy Pelosi's, but it's a great way of focusing us on the point is personal conversion, and the point is saving souls.
I think Catholics are really hungry for leadership. And I don't, as I said, I don't think it's necessarily the bishop's fault. I think there's this transitional, I think the old ways of communicating are not very effective, and the church is kind of a late adopter. And I also think the standard diocesan communications team is a B team, because that's just the reality. If they were the best communications team in the world, they probably wouldn't be working in a particular diocese. So I have sympathy for the bishop's struggle, but I've had these conversations with the Archbishop because, like I said, he is a humble man, and he's uncomfortable with self-promotion. And I flash back to the last big event I did before COVID, what I went to here in the DC area was the Arlington group. And Bishop Athanasius Schneider was coming to speak, and hundreds of people, probably at least 200-300 people showed up. And he was like a rock star, and it was a great event, and everyone was really happy. And I drove back in my car and I say, something is bothering me about this. What's wrong? Why am I bothered? And I went back to Wikipedia and looked up his biography, and I realized he's not the bishop of Kazakhstan. He's the auxiliary bishop of Kazakhstan. And we are so hungry for leadership. We're following the auxiliary bishop of Kazakhstan. And it's not his fault, but there's something wrong with that. So I tease the Archbishop when he sometimes worries about the promotion. I'm like, well, we could all go back to following the auxiliary bishop of Kazakhstan, but I think San Francisco is maybe a little more normal for the United States.
That's funny. Yeah. He has, nothing against Archbishop Schneider. It's just that
he's great. It's nothing, no problem. But it's the absence, not the presence. People are getting very excited about the auxiliary bishop of Kazakhstan because we're Catholics. We have to follow bishops, and we're not getting fed. So that's what really struck me about that phenomenon, and why I think I love the Archbishop, but I think his leadership is important for the church because people are very hungry for it.
Okay, so we talked about all the different things that the Institute does. I mean, well, we haven't really talked
anything about what
we haven't really actually we've mentioned it, but we now need to talk about the actual main mission of the Institute that's in its name, the sacred music and divine worship. I mean, the artistic and the liturgical things that the Institute does. So maybe you can just run down the different things the Institute has going on with regard to the liturgy, sacred music, and sacred art.
The mission is opening the door of beauty to God, right? The Archbishop Cordileone's insight, and I think he's 100% right, is that this is the neglected door, right? And it's odd because for centuries and centuries, it was a primary way that the Catholic Church evangelized. Pope Benedict talked about the only two effective apologia for the church are the goodness of its saints and the arts that were birthed in her womb. That may be an exaggeration, but and he thinks that in particular, because he said in the Enlightenment, both the culture and the Catholic culture believed in reason. So we had a basis for conversation. But the wider culture has abandoned reason, even though it likes to portray itself as the party of science. And so beauty gets around these cognitive barriers. It's like it's an experience of the sacred, and it moves people, and it brings people together. You know, that's why people go to rock concerts, not just because they like to hear the music, but because there's something about the process that makes people feel connected. And the liturgy is more than an art form. It's the miracle of bringing Jesus Christ back. But he, you know, as he wrote in the National Catholic Register about the Mass of the Americas in this January, he said, you know, the biggest there are many problems the church faces and many things we need to do, but the biggest problem, and he pointed to a pillar poll that showed 50% of Catholics who go to Mass every Sunday do not believe in the real presence. And that is, we're not evangelizing the people who are showing up on Sundays. So how are you going to go out and evangelize the culture until you figure out what is happening? And one of the things he believes strongly is the way we celebrate the liturgy, which does not point away from it doesn't point to the transcendent reality of what the Mass is. And so the mission, opening the door of beauty to God through practical resources for more beautiful and reverent liturgy, and energizing a Catholic culture of the arts. And these great new masses by Frank LaRocca that we've been commissioning, the Mass of the Americas, a Requiem Mass for the Homeless, which was first celebrated last November, and then July 1st in San Francisco, a new Mass in the extraordinary form honoring St. Junipero Serra. And then next January, there'll be a new Mass for Life, which will be celebrated before the West Coast Walk for Life. So those they're important in themselves. They gather a lot of people together. We get EWTN covers it. We're finding once again this second celebration on EWTN of the Mass of the Americas is going viral. 30 and so that demonstrates many people who have never experienced the sacred at the Mass in this quiet way are being exposed to it, and that's really important. And it also makes it shows that our tradition is not a dead tradition, that it continues to be live and vibrant. And so the vision is, this is the Renaissance or Counter-Reformation model, where we commission great new sacred music from the heart of the church on topics that are relevant and important to contemporary society. And then they win audiences by going through the great cathedrals before, we hope, in a century or so, ending up on Lincoln Center in secular concert form. So sacred music done as an act of worship, not merely as a concert. That's one of the most important things that we've done. We're building a community of artists. Our poet in residence, James Matthew Wilson, he's an amazing guy. Dana Joya called him the future of Catholic letters in America. And
he's my most frequent guest on this podcast, actually.
Well, that's terrific.
I've had him on like 5 times, I think.
You should have Joshua Haren on, his partner.
I had him on. We're friends. Yeah.
Okay,
I had him on a couple times now. He's a wonderful guy. Yeah. I actually just got my copy of his essay that you published today in the mail.
Well, we didn't publish it, but we're promoting it.
Oh, I see.
So we are, well, I don't know if you got the 15,000 word, which is the book that he's releasing on contemplative realism, right? So Joshua came to us and said, can you help me promote this? And so that's what we're doing, including helping him craft a 1,500 word that artists can sign on to. And I don't think the website is going to be up for a couple of days, but if you go to benedictinstitute.org, you will eventually be able to read it. it's an amazing piece of work, and it's pulling together a whole community of artists. And it's
Great.
the basic insight is that realism as movement, various realist movements in literary fiction, in the novel, are almost all predicated on the idea that God is not real, which means they're not based on reality, and they are cutting off the ability to experience the transcendent. And so, without dictating a specific form or mission or how an artist, with great respect for the diversity of the artist's calling, the idea that taking seriously what it means to contemplate the reality of God and allow that to affect the stories that we tell, even if Christ never makes any visible appearance in your novel, right? It affects the way we see the
Right.
world and what we see as possible and how we experience nature and how we suffer. And so all of
Right.
those things, I think it's really an extraordinary work coming out, and we're really pleased to be able to help with that. We have a whole year for St. Junipero Serra and the American Saints that comes. James Matthew Wilson wrote a song, I call it a song cycle. I think it's 7 poems. They're interconnected, inspired by the Mass of the Americas.
Yeah, we discussed that. That was his first time coming on the
And,
podcast. We talked about the River of the Immaculate
and
Conception.
let me ask you, did you know, I've never, at the reception after the Moda with 100 Catholics in the room, I said, do you know what the River of the Immaculate Conception is?
Oh, I knew that from talking to
You
him
know
and
it,
reading his
right? But
poem.
nobody else knows it, and it's the Mississippi River, right? Your listeners, if they
Right.
haven't seen that. So that's about taking seriously the deep Catholic roots of this country. It's not an
Yeah.
argument about whether we're a Protestant country or not. I'm not interested in that. It's about we Catholics telling our own stories, noticing our own history in this country, and
Right.
letting it affect our relationship. And Saint Junipero Serra, he's known as the Apostle of California and one of the founders
Right.
of California. But I got chills as I started to look into this. There's actually the Mission Dolores. So this new mass honoring Saint Junipero Serra will take place on his feast day, July 1st, in Mission Dolores, one of the missions that Saint Junipero founded in the year 1776, right? And there's actually a letter extant from Saint Junipero where he asks his brothers to pray for the success of George Washington.
Yes, that's
Isn't
great.
that amazing? It gives me chills. Like,
Yeah.
we just haven't thought about it, right? Like and again, I don't mean to displace the founding story of America, but to supplement it with taking seriously our own history here. And the first Christian service in America was a Catholic mass. I think it was in
Mm.
what we now call Augustin, Florida, but anyway. And okay, I could go on in that, but that's probably a topic for
Sure.
another show. So if you want to know what we do, we commission these masses. We provide a schola for the Archbishop to elevate the liturgy. We're looking for ways. We've started an ancient liturgies newsletter and conspiracy to help give Catholics in the Bay Area greater access to beautiful and reverent masses, whether it's in the ordinary form or the Byzantine Rite or the Dominican Latin Rite or the traditional Latin Mass.
That's amazing. And I know from people who live in California that that's much needed.
Yeah, and it's growing, and including high sung Anglican or just Novus Ordo masses. Professor Mart, the Stanford professor, has had a beautiful choir. He's been doing the Novus Ordo, for 50 years with Gregorian chant. So it's an inclusive movement. So in addition to the Mass, we commissioned a painting, St. Junipero Serra and the American Saints. We commissioned a painting on the patron saints of the homeless for the Requiem Mass for the homeless. We've commissioned a book. We pulled out. So for the painting, we pulled out 9 saints. And then we've asked Kevin Turley, who's a really gifted storyteller, to tell the story of these saints.
Great.
And we publish the only online magazine dedicated to the life and works of living Catholic artists, which is CatholicArtsToday.com. And that's not everything, but it's a lot.
with the exception of Frank LaRocca, I've had on my show like every artist that you guys have worked with, pretty much. I mean, Andrew Desai, even, who did some things with when the Mass of the Americas came to DC. He painted the Archbishop's portrait.
Yeah, he's wonderful.
I've had him on. I've known him since early on in this podcast. I've had him on a couple of times. James Matthew Wilson has been on 5 or 6 times. I've had Kevin Doak. I've had Joshua Wren. So I've been skirting around the edges of the Benedict XVI Institute for a while.
Terrific.
And it's great. And it's just great to see that patronage model. I'm a musician myself. It's great. It's great to see that the patronage model coming back, because that's so needed. It can't be all committees and grants and the sort of the more bureaucratic model. So the direct patronage model is really important.
One of the things that happened in our culture is so I think we're losing patrons who trust enough their own aesthetic responses to know that what they're funding is valuable, and it's kind of outsourced. On the one hand, there's the academy, which is now in the grips of a bizarre politicization of the arts, which is such a betrayal. I mean, there are artists who may be called to be political. That's one thing the arts could do. But the claim that the value of the arts lies in its political impact on social justice issues is just to say you don't think the arts are important in themselves. And
right.
I think a lot of artists are chafing under it, but there is that. So you either outsource it to an academy, and the academy is peculiar because it's or the critic, right? And they're forming a barrier between the artist and the audience, right? And then the other is the market. And I think it's the innate instinct of the businessman, who is the patron or the donor class, to believe that something is important when a lot of eyeballs see it. And that's actually missing the way I think about and what I know about how culture functions, because I could name you all kinds of writers of fiction and other works who were bestsellers and sold millions of copies and had zero cultural impact. So one of the things that we need is a better theory. If you want to build a successful culture, you need a better theory about how culture operates. And I think that's and part of it is, if you look at the biography of artists, like what gives the artist the energy to create? And one of the reasons cities are so important in the history of arts and letters and intellectual culture, but artists in particular, you'll find novelists, which is what I know best, they're often begin by writing for each other. So those Bronte sisters, their brother, who was an opium addict, was supposed to be the important one. They were in a rural vicarage since the age of 10, writing stories for each other, right? Before finally someone broke out. And so we pay a lot of attention to, if we can't pay anything else to our artists, we can pay attention. And so, for example, after the Requiem Mass for the Homeless, we brought together a working group of music directors and living Catholic composers to talk about how we create a better pipeline for living Catholic artists into parishes. We have projects that are not in a position to be launched yet about how you can help parishes that are interested create and sustain scholas. And one of the things we need to resist, sacred polyphony is challenging, and you may need professionals to do it if the music is complicated. But if you can talk, you can chant, right? Gregorian chant was the lingua franca of people who did not eat. Not only did they not know how to read music, they did not know how to read, right? So breaking through those barriers and figuring out the right kind of resources to help bring it to more parishes is a lot of what I see us doing, as well as continuing to breathe on this. Frank LaRocca, I think, understands. He's an amazing artist. I think he's a genius composer, but he's also in the nascent state of leading a school of artists. And that is actually how a work of art becomes important. It gives birth to more works of art. So that's part of the model that we're working on.
Yeah, that's great. And when you have patronage too, it's like there's a real investment. You were talking about people trusting their own judgment. There's also a real personal investment that you have when it's not, a fund or a committee or one of these bureaucratic things that you have out there for grant bestowing and things like that. It's like a person. It's like, this is my taste. This is what I like. And I can take personal pride in the fact that I had a part in making this happen. But so much today is like detached from the personal. So it's like nobody has skin in the game personally,
Well, I don't know. I would just say that I find foundation fundraising. I mean, I'm the only full-time employee of the Benedict XVI Institute, and I can only do what we do because I have several consultants who act like employees, although they're not. They're that committed. But the we're incredibly lean, and we do a lot, so much. I mean, I notice when we go around, sometimes people think we have a lot more money than we do. We're doing okay, but it's really, foundations have adopted an ethic that they want to make sure that their individual donation is valuable. So they get 100 organizations to invest a lot of time in a very lengthy and difficult proposal writing process, and then they give the money to one of them. And they're not concerned at all about having wasted 99 out of 100 people's time in applying for that grant, which is just a way of saying, I would love to do foundation fundraising, but it would require staff dedicated to that alone. And what I do find is both. So we've grown over the last 4 years, and again, primarily because of Archbishop's leadership, from, I don't know, since Free the Mass, we've grown from about 500 donors to 7,000 donors. And our list has grown, which we communicate directly with. From when I started, I brought in a list of about 10,000 that I had just absentmindedly assembled, hardly ever communicating with it. And it's now almost 90,000.
Wow.
So it's just between what we might think of as crowdsourcing, but it's a lot of work too. I mean, I write a very personal letter every week. And if anyone emails me, I write back. It's like, building those relationships with the crowd is also, it's all a lot of work, but it's very valuable. And so I don't know how that intersects. I don't know. All I know is that it takes so much time to just put together the proposal for a foundation grant. And I'd love to get foundation money, but it hasn't happened yet. And I think it would have to wait until we can do it. So, but patrons of the art, I think, so, but they do need, you need that combination of outside validation too. And one of the things that's happened with us is right before the Mass of the Americas in New York, Blanton Allspaw, who has won 11 Grammys, including 3 times Classical Music Producer of the Year, 25 nominations, decided, he saw something that James Matthew Wilson wrote in an op-ed he wrote about St. Junipero Serra, actually, for the Wall Street Journal, which mentioned the Mass of the Americas and Richard Sparks. And he knew Richard Sparks, our conductor, is really a world-class conductor, first quality. And so he approached him about the idea of doing a studio recording. And so that happened. We gathered the best singers from all over America, and it was recorded. And now record labels are, who work with Blanton Allspaw are interested in this. And it's a kind of affirmation of that the art world, as well as the religious world, sees this as important and first quality. So,
well, that's great. Yeah, I'd love to hear that. I love the music. So, yeah, you've been a wonderful guest. I'm really happy to have spoken with you, Maggie.
It's me. It was fun.
So people can go to benedictinstitute.org to check out the work of the Benedict the 16th Institute. And I will also link to the YouTube channel so that people can see some of the clips of the artists that have been involved. And
we do a lot of great Zoom events. During COVID, we went full Zoom. And so we're back both in the real world, but we also do really interesting events that anyone can attend.
Right.
So by all means, go to benedictinstitute.org and hit the subscribe button, and then you'll hear from me what's what. We love to have you be part of this community. We also have been doing artist retreats via Zoom, which have been
great.
very successful. So if you're a Catholic creative in particular, it's an open invitation. And we're going down February 23rd. We will have such a Zoom event with Joshua Haren to discuss contemplative realism, and I don't know exactly who all the guests will be, but it's going to be a good group.
Thanks everybody for listening. Please do go to the Benedict Institute website and check out what they're doing there. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe. And also, if you'd like to help keep this show going, all of our podcasts here at the Catholic Culture Podcast Network just run on the generosity of listeners. So please go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio, and your donation will be earmarked specifically for our podcast content.